This is the Good Morning ISLA 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Hello and welcome. Today, Safia, Zein, and I are going to be leading a discussion based around the question, how has Islam worked and developed as a social movement, and especially the role of education in that development.
Hey Pierre, I think today will be an interesting discussion. We'll be joined by Abby and Camden to hear about Islam and its development as a social movement in both a historical and modern context.
Hey guys, I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Ever since the Prophet Muhammad had his first revelation on Mount Hira, Islam has spread globally and people have different ways of expressing their identities through Islam.
Yeah, in fact, one could say that there are multiple Islams. I think that the variation in Islamic practices can be fascinating to interpret and learn about, and I'm specifically excited to hear about the Yan Taru movement, which I believe Abby will be presenting. To give a brief overview to our listeners who haven't heard about the Yan Taru, it's a West African movement where Muslim women traveled and spread Islamic teachings.
To be more specific, the Yan Taru was founded by Nana Asma'u, daughter of the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate. This movement is unique because aside from its social implications, it also had a hefty educational impact. Through Nana Asma'u's innovation, many women learned how to read and write, especially through reading the Quran.
Female perspectives are often erased in normative teachings of Islam, so I think this will be an eye-opening experience. I remember in our small group discussions, Ms. Bukhari mentioned how the female perspectives in Islamic history were so sparse they were often presented by men. Circling back to our other presenter, Camden, I believe they will be focusing on the multitude of identities that can be fostered and created through Islam. They'll be talking about a photo series called Just Me and Allah.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a photo series illustrating intersectional identities through queer Muslim stories, ranging from perspectives both in Islamic countries and in the Western world. This is an often forgotten topic, which I think led the photographer Samra Habib to share their own memoir.
Yeah, this is especially relevant to Montreal. I remember 1 or 2 months ago, there were a series of anti-trans protests taking place in the heart of the city, as well as major cities in Canada. This protest was really ostracizing for a lot of people because it created a dichotomy between religious groups, specifically Muslim ones, and the trans community. The growing tension between the two groups was accentuated by the media, making the divide even larger when there's people who identify strongly with both sides.
Yeah, I was at one of the counter-protests and it was pretty scary. I can't imagine how it would have felt to see two sides of your own identity in conflict in such an apparent manner. Similarly to Nana Asma'u, this is a story that gets purposefully left behind to fit a certain narrative.
Well, it seems there's going to be a lot to say, so let's pass the mic to Abby. Hi Abby.
Hi guys, I'm super excited to be here. I'm Abby.
Hi Abby, thank you for joining us today. Can you please explain to us the Yan Taru movement and specifically who Nana Asma'u was?
So Nana Asma'u was the daughter of Usman Dan Fodio, who was the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate. And the Sokoto Caliphate is considered one of the most developed and one of the most at its height basically had around 20 million people, and it was founded in almost a similar fashion to Prophet Muhammad's journey from Mecca to Medina to Mecca, because Sokoto Usman Dan Fodio was in the Hausa land, the Hausa kingdom, so he was born in Hausa land, and he was preaching and teaching Islam until he began being persecuted for it because the leader at that time was jealous or wary of the influence he had. So he leaves Hausa land and he founds the Sokoto Caliphate in wars of expansion called the Fulani Wars. So she is born in the Fulani Wars and she kind of grows up during this time of expansion. And she's taught by her mother and her grandmother, her sisters as well, how to read and write in Arabic, how to learn in other kinds of ways. But we should know that she's not the only famous woman scholar. Yeah.
So what made Nana Asma'u special?
Yeah, so she wasn't the only like famous scholar and writer. Like her mother and her grandmother, her sisters as well, were also poets and writers. But what made her really special was that after her father passes away, and her brother then becomes like the caliph of the Sokoto Caliphate, she's like given the role of like writing down like her father and like her kingdom and her people's history. And so like she has over 60 surviving works, but there are apparently like hundreds more that like we've lost. But a lot of her work was just writing down her father's history, writing down her people's history. And because of that, she's exposed to like 4 languages. At some point she learned could speak Hausa for full day, Arabic, and like Tuareg, which is like the nomadic language. And then she begins writing like very expansively.
So in that context, what is the Yan Taru?
So the Yan Taru movement is the name given to an education like system that Nana Asma'u founds in the Sokoto Caliphate, because keep in mind she comes from like a very scholastic family and tradition and clan. So everyone in the Fulani clan at that point could read and write, and as her family is expanding this caliphate, she comes to realize like a lot of women who are in the Hausa or Oyo or Kano empires where her father is expanding to don't have the same like freedom and mobility and education that she does. So she begins teaching. And she begins teaching actually at the age of 14. Not the Yan Taru, but like actual teaching. And then when she's a bit older, we don't really have the exact like her like ages when she begins teaching, but she founds this movement of these women who are called jajis, forgive my pronunciation, and it just means like teachers, and they travel across the caliphate in like groups, and they have like almost like classes in different homes in different villages, and they teach basic like Quranic education, so how to memorize the Quran, learning the surahs, learning the Arabic language, because at that time, though like the Arab Peninsula is not their like center, it's considered like a sign of good education and like a good like commitment to your faith to be able to read and write in Arabic. And her husband was like a very well-known Arabist as well. So that's the Yan Taru.
So what made this education an Islamic education?
So what made it Islamic is that she was very committed to her faith. Her family are, at this point, they're Qadiriya Sufis, so a sect of Sufism, and she's been trained and taught in Islamic education, so she just begins teaching it. So from the base, she first teaches kind of mnemonic devices on how to memorize the surah. Like that's like the basic teaching that everybody gets from the Yan Taru. And she writes a poem called Qasida fi Munaja, which is an instructional poem on the Quran and Quranic memorization. So at its root, it's very much like Islamic teaching. They learn the hadith, they learn kind of just Islamic teaching and Islamic reading and writing. And she writes this poem, which is like her most well-known poem, well, at the time, called A Plea to Saintly Women. I will not try and say it actually in the language, like in Ajami, but I'll just leave it. And it's a hagiography for like pious Muslim women. And it's supposed to kind of show women and highlight to women how good it is to be like prosperous in your religious life, because it's like it journeys women from like the prophetic times, so like the prophet's wives, and then throughout into like West Africa, who are like prosperous and very well educated in their formal and spiritual education. So it is like at its base like Islamic and Quranic also like teaching and education.
Why do you think this is such an important topic, specifically in the Islamic context?
So because obviously we're in an Islamic civilization class, I think it's important to look at other civilizations that are not necessarily in the like Arab or Persian peninsula who are also practicing Islam. And also because it's West Africa and it's very unique, like they had their own languages and their own kind of incorporation of Islam into kind of their societies. And I think it's important to know as well, because it's good to see women who are intersectional in their identity. Like she's West African, she's a black woman as well, but she's also like a very well-known scholar. Like at her height, she had like a lot of connections throughout the Arabic world, from Damascus to Mecca to like to other places in the world where she was like, people were like looking for her for advice and like what they should write, what they should do. And I think it's also good to have different perspectives on Islam. to see that like it's not the exact way that we're taught it, that it's you can have somebody who's well educated, who's a woman, who is allowed to have her space in like a very large and very influential empire. And also because we were looking at West African Islam and civilization earlier, I think it's important to look at Africa as a continent and as a place prior to slavery, prior to learning what it was like before colonial encroachment into the continent, and seeing how different religions and people kind of existed and coexisted. I think it gives color to like a very blank space that we're kind of thrown at in a lot of our education.
How is this relevant in today's modern society?
So the Yan Taru movement, it kind of exists in kind of spits and fits like after the fall of the Sokoto Caliphate. And it was kind of became more popular in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Throughout, I want to say like the expansion of Islam in North America, but also like within academic field where people are like, oh my god, we had like poets in West Africa who were reading and writing in Ajami script and who are doing all these really amazing things. Let's look at them more. So there is like a general like consensus that there is Yan Taru around the world, especially Nigeria, not in the exact same ways as it was like a huge education movement, but just in terms of like remembering who these people were, looking back at the Sokoto Caliphate and Nana Asma'u as like a female scholar and teacher and other women in the same field. And I think it's also important because it's good and it's like imperative to have historical figures who look and speak like a lot of people in the world who are part of the global majority, who are different versions of like Black womanhood and Islam and identities. And yes.
The Yan Taru movement was an influential part of history, specifically in the development of Islam in a West African context. It's interesting to hear about Islam outside of an Arab context, especially through a female perspective.
Yeah, and a large part of this episode was bringing up forgotten points of view, which in Islamic education usually belong to female and queer Muslims. After this insightful presentation about Nana Asma'u and the Yan Taru movement, we're going to move on to Camden's presentation on queer Muslim viewpoints in education. So let's pass the mic to Camden. Hi, Camden.
Hi, like they've been saying, I'm Cam, I use they, them pronouns, and I'm here to discuss the queer Muslim movement across the world and how education has played into their advocacy. So I want to start with the intention behind the project. The creator, Samra Habib, is a Pakistani-Canadian photographer. Their book, which came from this series, like Pierre mentioned, became a national bestseller, and it was even named one of the most influential queer books of all time. While I haven't read the book, I know it is a deep dive into Habib's upbringing and the way they were instructed to live their life.
Can you tell us about some of the stories?
Yeah, like I said, the intention was to share queer Muslim stories across the diaspora, quote unquote, because there isn't truly a Muslim diaspora. And challenge like stereotypical notions of piety, conservatism, seclusion, and oppression that the West has come to equate with Islam. So I'm going to focus on just a few stories, but I encourage everyone to read the whole series as it's really short and insightful. I'd like to preface that the subject's pronouns aren't listed in their brief interviews, and I discourage people from making assumptions. All right. So the first story I'll be talking about is about a person named Saba, who is from Durham, North Carolina in the United States. They grew up in the United States, queer and Muslim, and they began embracing wearing their hijab as a form of personal protest and a connection to Muslim identity. And they wanted to sort of connect being Western and Muslim, and they began making hijabs out of Western textiles as a project with their mother, as a way to connect with this heritage.
I believe they started this during the Trump presidency. Do you think it had any influence on their story?
Definitely. They talked about being queer and Muslim in Trump's America and how there are many fears of legal restrictions on rights in a queer sense, and also in being Muslim, such as like Muslim registries that were a fear at one point. And hate crimes on multiple levels. But this choice to wear the hijab and make the ones out of the Western fabrics was a indirect opposition to that sort of the hate that spewed from the Trump presidency. The next story I'm going to talk about is about Raisa, excuse my pronunciation. Now lives in Brussels but grew up in Mali, where her family knew she was transgender but had forbidden her from expressing that identity. On the other hand, her teachers really liked her because she had applied herself a lot to school as a result of being excluded and sort of repressing her trans identity.
How did Islam and education play into her upbringing and practice of Islam?
So I believe, began her university education in Cameroon, where the LGBTQ plus movement was a lot more prominent. But there she was also able to access hormones, but she was also working, I believe, in association with the Mali government. And there was still a lot of fear of harassment and oppression. And one night she was even beaten nearly half to death outside a club because of this. So now she lives in Brussels seeking asylum and can't imagine going back to Mali, as she said in her interview. But in terms of education, when she was young, she went to Quran school, where her imam had said LGBT people would go to hell. And she obviously had issues with that, saying, why would this place not want me to go there? But Allah loves, like a lot of conversations that a lot of queer people have in their heads. But in the end, she feels like a lot of peace in reciting the Quran and praying to Allah, and it's an example of how sort of a maybe not positive Islamic education can grow into a positive and healing one.
Where did the title come from?
So the title came from an interview with Layla, who lives in Berlin, Germany, and they have a lot of tattoos, like visible tattoos, which provoke a lot of judgment from stricter and more conservative Muslims. And her response to that is that they are just between me and Allah. So that's where the title of the project came from, but it's also sort of representative of Islam, meaning submission, like personal submission to God, and then as it applies to all religions, it's a personal interpretation, a personal belief and following that isn't up to anyone else to decide. So she uses both education to teach that to her own children.
Earlier we talked about being queer in Trump's America. Did any of these stories touch on these interacting identities in a post-9/11 context?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the last photos on the Tumblr version of the photo series is about Harry, who lives in Brooklyn, New York, United States. And they are the child of, I believe, a Lebanese mother and a Greek dad. And in this post-9/11 context, they really wanted to embrace their Americanness, sort of in opposition to the Islamophobia that was presented in the media. Similarly, with an opposition in the American and the Muslim identity that their family felt, Harry also felt like a opposition between being queer and being Muslim. But luckily, their family was actually very accepting, which you don't get to hear a lot of in Muslim queer representations. A lot of the time, it's an oppressive family, but now with this story, you get to hear a more positive story. And so Harry now, I believe, works in social work, helping other Arab people and queer people in New York.
Like you said, Habib is a Pakistani-Canadian. How does this series connect to Montreal?
So connecting to Montreal and North America in general, recently there's been waves of anti-trans legislation, both legally and in a school context. And in portrayals in the media, a lot of times this is being shown as, oh, trans and queer people versus conservatives a lot of the time, who are being portrayed as largely Muslim or immigrant populations, which makes queer Muslims or queer immigrants or anyone in either group feel a lot of tension within their own identities and, say, within family members or friends who also accept this identity.
An article about this project describes how Christian and Jewish LGBTQ plus people and spaces are more visible and accessible. What do you think the project does to increase queer Muslim visibility?
I think it, first of all, calls out a need for the places like this, and the fact that queer Muslim people exist, are struggling, and need places to thrive. And then it also details like intersectionality, not just for Muslim and queer people, but how it exists everywhere in all parts of an identity, and parts of an identity don't need to be at war. They can coexist and even work together when they were previously thought to not be able to do so.
This production is a lot more modern compared to the Yan Taru movement. What significance does this have?
Modernity definitely does have significance on top of the place where it's taking place. So with modernity, it's an online project. People can access it from almost anywhere. And the Yan Taru movement, where we can bring Abby back to say some about, it's regionally specific and a lot older, a lot less harder to access and to get information about it.
And I think also because it's pre-colonial, there's a big effect on, I guess I want to say, British and German and French colonial intrusion in what is the remnants of the Sokoto Caliphate, so which is now modern like Cameroon, Niger, and how the breakage of such a big empire affects what is left over. So yes, her writings, 60 of them are still in circulation, but the movement itself has degraded because there's no need for a caliphate to educate a bunch of people. But it's still, it depends, because you have North America as the center of the world, and then you have regional parts of the world that are kind of left in the brink of things.
So bringing Camden and Abby back together to relate their topics to one another, many of these subjects were influenced by their Islamic education, and we want to know in what ways that was done. How do they continue their own education and that of those around them?
So I think listening to Camden's topic, I think it's important to see that Islamic education can and has changed throughout time and space. So with the Sokoto Caliphate specifically, Usman Dan Fodio and I guess his family tried to bring a more, I wouldn't think they would think it was modern or kind of progressive, but a more progressive look at society where women are included, where education is imperative to societal change. So in this case, it's less about the personal connection between God, Allah, and someone, but more about how Islam is a societal, a tool for social cohesion, because you have all these different people coming together under one big empire. How do you make them one? How do you bring cohesion into one, a big group of people? And also because, again, she was, Nana Asma'u, a very pious, very religious woman, kind of seeing how that change and challenge her life, and how that was a big reflection of her writings, and how her and her family kind of lived their lives and ruled this huge kind of part of the world.
Yeah, a big thing we see with both of these movements is Islam as an oppressor and an oppressed based on when and where you are in the world. And say for being in a Muslim country like that, being Muslim gives you privilege, whereas being in North America, it might come with a little less privilege. And so a lot of the people in the Just Me and Allah photo series had to sort of battle the oppressive Islamic education they were taught maybe back home, and then restructure that to fit and accept and live with their queer identity. And then they also continue this education both with their own families and preaching a loving Islam, a personal Islam, and one that is adaptive, that can adapt to all sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think the adaptive element of Islam is very important, because also historically, and also just looking at West African Islamic civilizations, you have something like Ajami script as like a real tangible like kind of way of seeing how Islam is adaptive, because it's an amalgamation of like Arabic script and then African languages, so Swahili or Fulfulde or Hausa, and then seeing how that has changed to make it more accessible to more people in this part of the world, because it's not this one stringent, like specific, like this is the only way Islam is, but seeing how historically as well it's been adaptable within writing, within reading, within like how people learn and like see the world.
And with Yan Taru and with the queer Muslim movement in North America and in the West in general, you see how Islam doesn't have to be an identity that's in opposition to anything else, like being a woman, being American, being queer, anything like that. They can all coexist and work together.
Before we end things off, do you guys have anything to add?
Just a final thing, I think like I really enjoyed reading up on this woman, and I think like she's really interesting, so I think you guys should just like read more about her. Like she spoke like 5 languages, guys. She was a skilled writer, and also interesting fact, her name, like Nana, is a colloquialism for teacher, and like in Arabic manuscripts about her written by like her husband and her brother and even like her dad, she's referred to as like Saliha, which means righteous, or like Waliya, which means saintly, or Zahida, which is like aesthetic. So like she's a very pious religious woman, and she's also like a governmental advisor. Like she was like in the rooms where things were happening. She was doing like things to like widen her empire. So she's really, really cool, guys. You guys should like go research on her and like her sisters and her brother. So yeah.
And you can find Samra Habib on Instagram at samra.habib, on X at The Real Sam Sam, and also their book, We Have Always Been Here, online and in stores.
Well, that was a really good talk. As someone who grew up in a conservative Muslim household, these topics and the discussions from Camden and Abby really widened my perspective of Islam.
Yeah, personally, I've seen a lot of intersectional Muslim perspectives and point of views, but these identities have always been private, so I think it was really special to learn about people who actively express these major parts of their lives and all the challenges that came with them.
Yeah, I think there's a common misconception that queer Muslims are only religious for the sake of being religious, but hearing about the photography project really demonstrates how queer Muslims aren't a homogeneous group. They have their own ways of practicing and questioning Islam, which in many ways is encouraged in the Quran.
Obviously, education plays a large role in this process, both in terms of learning about historical figures and the actual education that has trickled down into what we are now taught. Nana Asma'u embodies this process, as she not only played a pivotal role in education in the Sokoto Caliphate, but she is left out of modern education about Islamic historical figures. This lack of female scholars in Islamic education, both modern times and historically, fundamentally changed the way Muslims practice their beliefs, as well as the space female Muslims are given to navigate the world today.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it's one that should urge people to look within themselves and question their own education. We've all been taught some sort of bias, and as taught in Islam, it's crucial to question your beliefs. I think we should also think about why this bias is present in the first place, and maybe what we can do about it.
I suppose that's why people like Abby, teaching about these historical female figures that have been forgotten are so important. We may not be able to change the roots of these biases, but maybe we can educate ourselves and the people coming after us.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation dove into a lot of heavy topics, and we all have a lot to think about, and I really want to thank Abby and Camden for joining us today and talking about these difficult subjects. It was really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us, and it was great being here.
And thank you to our listeners. We advise you to listen to the other episodes from our ISLA 200 podcast, as they may answer any burning questions you're left with. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you take a lot with you as you go.
podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.